Well, why doesn't he show himself when humans need him the most? For example, Holocaust, things that happen in this world.
Yeah, I just got done writing a book called God's Crime Scene, where we're talking about one chapter on the problem of evil. And I think that it's very complex. Detectives work acts of evil all the time. And every time we work an act of evil, we discover that there are several reasons why this particular crime happened this day. It's lots of different factors. Our job is to figure out all the factors that were in play, what the relationships, between the factors were, how large certain factors are, how small others are. And it's very complex. The same thing is true with God. Why would God allow anything? One of the kind of quickest things that really changed my thinking on this is a simple principle. All right, give me a second to play it out for you. As an atheist, I believe that my life was a line segment between birth and death. 90 years long, birth, 90 years, death, you're back in the dirt. That's what you get, 90 years. And so I would have said, if I'd have gotten sick at age 40 with cancer and suffered for 10 years and died at 50, I would have seen that as a supreme evil, because it would have robbed me of the 40 years I expected to get pain-free. 90 pain-free years of my expectation. But what if my foundational view of what life is was wrong? And it's not a line segment from birth to death, but it's a ray. Birth, through the point we call death, and off into the distance, forever, infinite. There are people who have suffered a surgery that was very painful and almost died in the first year of life, but by the time they're 3, they're healthy, they're fine. They don't even remember the pain they suffered as a 1-year-old. And it's because the longer you live, the pain starts to take a proportion. Evil is now proportionate to the length of your life. So for me, as an atheist, I only had 90 years to play with. Anything that happened in that 90 years, I would have seen as evil if it was painful, or if it was sad, or I suffered some loss. But what if life is eternal? Now, whatever your whole life is of 90 years, as this line stretches out into infinity, your temporal earthly life is smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller by proportion to eternity. So at 1,000 years, that 90 years is pretty small. At 1,000,000 years, that 90 years is tiny. At 10 million years, you got a blip on the radar. So whatever pain you suffer, even if your entire 90 years was terrible, if it's true, if Christianity is true, we are eternal beings that get to be in eternity with God forever in bliss. That's our life. So we have this tendency to say, why would God allow this, as if this life is all there is, when in fact, God is dealing with us as eternal creatures. And with this little suffering we're going to go through, this is why Peter says that, he calls the suffering kind of minor in 1 Peter. And if you think about the suffering his readers were experiencing, it wasn't minor, but he always talks about it in light of eternity. So I don't care what you're going through. If there is an eternal God who's created you to be an eternal creature, you've got to weigh suffering or evil on the scale of eternity, not on the scale of 90 years. So you say, okay, this is bad. Why is God allowing this to happen to you? Really? I mean, we got parents, right? Why wouldn't, sometimes my kids, and they grow up and they leave the house, and I'm thinking they can use a little money, but I don't send it to them, because I know they've got to earn that on their own. I can't bail them out at every turn. They got to suffer a little bit. They can't have all the luxuries in the first year of employment. They get those down the road, and I let them get those later, because I know that this little thing right here is important in character developing. It's important to understand and appreciate the things in totality. I let them kind of suffer a little bit to achieve a greater end. Well, what if God is dealing with all of eternity? Might he let something happen in the first 90 years to develop our character, because he really is concerned with our character at year 4063? I don't know. But I think we have to at least kind of measure this, though, our whatever suffering is, in the context of eternity, and stop seeing it in the context of 90 years.
Which the point that you brought up, I had never actually thought of it like that. And it's so basic and so simple, but so many of us just only see this life. And we say we believe in the life after death, but if that's the case, then we shouldn't be worried about what's going on in this life, because we have, like you said, millions of years for us to live, which is forever.
Well, think about this too. The things as an atheist that I thought were valuable in the world, as a non-believer, I would have said, well, courage is important. That's a virtue I want my kids to have. I wasn't a believer, but I wanted my kids to be courageous. Mm-hmm. I wanted them to have empathy. I wanted them to be a forgiving kind of kids. I wanted my kids to really know what self-sacrifice was and charity. Really? Well, if I'm going to create a universe in which we get those kinds of attributes, Think about this for a second. How do I get courage? Courage is only manifest in the face of danger. If you want to raise up a group that is courageous, they have to be exposed to danger all the time so they can become courageous. You want empathy? Well, they're going to be what are they empathizing toward? People who are suffering. So a world without suffering has no empathy. You want that virtue called empathy? You got to have a world that has some suffering in it. You want to have the virtue we call charity? Well, you're going to have a world that has poverty in it. You want to have forgiveness? You got to have some evil that's been acted upon that you have to forgive. It turns out all the values, the character values that we want, even as atheists, you can't get unless you have a world that causes these virtues to rise to the top. So it might be that I would let my kids suffer a little bit because I know there's a character benefit that they will actually experience. And what if the period that we're talking about is not me, thinking for a year the kids can go without that. It's 90 years because they can go without that because they've got all eternity. And this is where we're going to develop the character that will go with you into all eternity. So I think there are some ways of looking at this to say, well, God may, in context of eternity, love us enough to care more about our character than comfort, and to want to get those attributes to emerge. He might expose us to some things that will cause us to that's why I never pray for patience, right? You pray for patience, God's going to give you something you have to endure. So be careful. If you don't just get patience like that, you get patience as a result of having to endure something difficult. So don't be praying for patience.
That's good advice. I'm going to stop praying for patience. Lord, please.
So what you see is that word we use for slave, we have a certain defined meaning for that word when we hear it. If I mention the word slave today, most people think of a New World slavery that we saw when people were captured in, say, Africa, brought to the New World, and forced into bondage and slavery. And that's the way we see slavery given the context of the word today. But the word that was used for slave in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, and also in the New Testament, is a very different kind of indentured servitude. And so everything about slavery then was different than slavery we think about in New World slavery. For example, the way that people enter into slavery in the New World was they were usually captured into slavery against their will. The way that people entered into indentured servitude in the Old World was usually through some crime. Remember, we've got no jail system. We can't house people in jail. So criminals often had to pay their debt through some act of servitude. Even war criminals would pay their debt through some act of servitude. And many people who were just in debt because they had borrowed or whatever would work off their indebtedness through some act of servitude. And when we think about even the punishments and the way slaves are treated in the New World compared to how they were treated in the ancient Near East, it's very, very different. So of all the cultures that are of antiquity, the Jewish culture had the highest regard for those indentured servitudes who were paying off debt or were acting out or serving out a crime. They were treated and allowed to be freed over certain periods of time. They were treated with certain rights that were not offered in the New World slavery. So we have to be careful when we see what is being described in Scripture, thinking to ourselves, oh, they're talking about the same kind of slavery that was in America before the Civil War. No, they're not talking about that. They're talking about people who entered voluntarily, who had an exit route that was they could earn out, and they also had a system in place to treat them a certain way while they were in indentured servitude. So everything about the way in, the way you were treated while you were there, and the way out is different in the New World slavery we think about and in the ancient Near Eastern slavery that we see represented in Scripture. So what we're doing here is we're looking at really a way that people could either serve a sentence for a crime or could pay off a debt. And that's why it's a very different system. So you have to be careful about equating the two. So remember, people would actually not equate the two very well and misinterpret it. And some Christians before the Civil War would actually use Scripture to justify their ownership of slaves. And that's often pointed to by the skeptic who says, well, wait a minute, all you Christians thought that slavery was okay before the Civil War. That's not actually true. There definitely were people who misinterpreted Scripture to justify their position. But who were the abolitionists? Who were the people who actually ended slavery, and what caused them to end slavery? Oh, those were Christians who were reading Scripture, understood what it meant, and wanted to see an end to the New World slavery that we see. Wilberforce was a Christian motivated by his Christian faith to be an abolitionist in Europe to end slavery. So I think that this demonstrates that Christianity doesn't teach that slavery is acceptable, and it's not the kind of slavery we're thinking about anyway. And it was Christians who, at the proper reading of Scripture, ended the slave movement, and it was driven by a Christian worldview. So I think this is something we got to keep in mind when we talk about, does Christianity either support slavery? And if it does, what kind are we talking about here? What are we really talking about?
A lot of Christians will claim we're Christian and we're not reading our Bibles, and we can't expect other people who are not Christian to follow the faith if we can't even defend it ourselves.
Yeah, we have to have some sense of what the ancient Near East was like and what the first century around Galilee was like in order to understand what the Old Testament is teaching, what the New Testament is teaching. We have a tendency to apply, hey, whatever it's like today in 2016 in my state, that must have been what it was like there. Of course it wasn't. And one of the most interesting parts of that is just this idea we talked about, that there was no way to serve sentences related to theft, or to serve sentences related to indebtedness, or to serve sentences related to certain kinds of crimes. This was one of the ways that the ancient Near Eastern culture would actually serve those kinds of sentences. So that's why you will sometimes see that war criminals, for example, will have a certain season of indentured servitude. Then later on you'll see in Scripture that group has now been assimilated into the culture. Well, why? It's because, like I said, different way into slavery, different way out, and a different experience while you were there, because this is not New World slavery like you think of here and before the Civil War.